Thank you very much. So my name is, it's not on the board. My name's Ian Gulland. I'm Chief Exec at Zero Waste Scotland. So welcome to this event today to talk about consumption. So when we were planning, when Zero Waste Scotland was planning for our COP26 events or input as an organisation, we were very clear that we felt that two things we certainly felt were missing from the agenda at COP26 was consumption, the issue of consumption that is having such an impact, not just on climate change, but also on biodiversity loss, not just here in Scotland, but globally as well. So we felt we really wanted to start a conversation with our partners, both here in Scotland and abroad, around the issue of consumption. So we have been doing that over the last couple of months, and I know many of you will have been aware of our other event we had at the beginning of September, October, that we held on consumption. So we felt it was very important to continue that all the way into COP. The other thing that we felt was missing, which is certainly linked to the idea of consumption, is food waste, and the impact of food waste on climate change, again, biodiversity loss, and tackling inequalities as well. So that's another thing we might pick up on as well during this discussion. So this morning's event is very much just to explore a little bit more about this issue of consumption and how do we tackle it, and how do we start to try and address it, and think of strategies, particularly the circular economy strategy, which we are very much supporting the transition here in Scotland, and just to try and explore a little bit more about what's happening, the progress that we're making, but also some of the bigger opportunities ahead for us as a nation. I'd like to explore that. So I'm going to explore that with an esteemed panel. So to my right, well, talking about the circular economy, Scotland's first circular economy minister, Lorna Slater, who has just joined the government, or yes, in the last few weeks. So very much, and we'll hear from her about her ambitions around the circular economy and the consumption agenda here in Scotland. We've also got Joss from Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who obviously we know the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been pioneering quite a lot of the circular economy activity at a global level, working with not just partners like ourselves here in Scotland, but a lot of big corporates and other businesses and governments around the world. So we're interested to hear from that, with that global perspective. And I've got Stuart Patrick, Chief Exec from Glasgow Chamber of Commerce, and I think it's highly important to have Stuart here, because we can talk about all of this sometimes around strategies for circular economy and tackling consumption, but you live and breathe trying to deliver some of this on the ground, both as a partner of Zero Waste Scotland, but more importantly as a partner with the citizens and the businesses of Glasgow. And how, to some extent, some of the challenges that are in front of you as a city, but also massive opportunities that we could all embrace. Well, you could embrace here in Glasgow, and we could start to replicate in other parts of Scotland and beyond. So I'm just going to really open it up, have a discussion now. I guess I started by saying we were, slightly disappointed that the circular economy wasn't as prominent on the COP26 agenda leading up to the event. I know I've been here for a week. I know that you're really just joining, Minister, the COP26 in Glasgow, and Josh, you've just arrived as well. My sense is it still isn't on the agenda as much as we would like, in terms of the circular economy and the opportunities that brings in terms of reducing climate emissions, but also tackling consumption, which has the wider impact possibly in terms of biodiversity loss and water stress. So I guess I'd be interested in your views. I'll start with yourself, Minister. But is that something to worry about, the fact it's not high on the agenda, or is it just a timing thing that eventually people are going to get into the circular economy and it'll just happen? People will suddenly realise that we need to be more circular, and it'll all work itself out, or is it something that it's a massive emission that's going to come back and bite us later on?
I think it is a worry that it's not higher up the agenda, but I think it's one of those things that we really need to kind of get the word out on, because you hear all these activists and protesters calling for change. Stop talking, do change. They want to see change. And the circular economy is one of those places where we see change. When people say, oh, the climate, what are we going to do? Well, the answer is the circular economy. This is where the action part comes in. And this is where we will see our society transform from a society where instead of valuing how much stuff we can buy, we instead have moved to a society where we value other things, where we instead value the amount of time we can spend with our family and friends, where we value having a meaningful job that pays a living wage rather than trying to make a fortune working 80 hours a week but never getting to see our kids or never getting to enjoy the green spaces or wonderful things in our communities. Circular economy is really the transformation that we need, and it's about changing how we spend our money. It's about changing what we buy and when we buy it, and really about what we value in our lives. And I think we are already seeing some of this change, especially on a generational level. We know that young people tend to spend their money on experiences rather than stuff. We know that young people particularly want meaningful jobs where they can know they're making a change, that they're making the world a better place. They're not so interested in just being able to buy stuff. We're not going to measure our value as human beings by how much stuff we own, but rather on how well we contribute to our community and how fully we are able to participate in that community. We'll have wonderful lives. This idea that to tackle climate change, we have to sacrifice, I think isn't true at all. To tackle climate change, we have to build wonderful lives where we engage with our communities, where we share those things that matter, where we have work-life balance, where we spend more time with our kids, where our city centers are green places where kids can play and people can safely wheel and cycle. That's the future we can build. And so when people say we need change, we need positive change. We need all those wonderful things. So that's what the circular economy is changing our society so that we really have a chance to enjoy those things in life. And that means not wasting our society's resources on things that we don't need. So we all know, and we all know this frustrating feeling, when you want to buy a thing. For example, I had to buy some carbon monoxide monitors this week because of the new law that's coming in. That's all I wanted. I wanted carbon monoxide monitors. But along with that came mounds of packaging. I didn't want that. I didn't want to buy those things, and yet I'm forced to consume that, which I didn't want. So if you think all of those resources that went into designing that packaging, making that packaging, printing it, giving it to my house, which I will now then put straight into the recycling bin. Okay, it's going to be recycled, but what a waste of resource. We're always talking about shortages. There's not enough money, there's not enough time, there's not enough trees, there's not enough of stuff. Well, we're wasting an awful lot of it on things that none of us want. So a big part of the circular economy is making sure we're using our resources and our time on those things that really matter.
Okay, thank you. We're going to talk about packaging in another session later, so look forward to that. Joss.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Minister, for that. It was very interesting to hear the word value come out of your first address right now, because it is about the way we create value, actually. And the industrial model, the take, make, and dispose model, makes and creates value by extracting stuff and disposing of stuff. That's the way we do it. It's throughput. It flows through the system, but that has a material, but it also has a GHG emissions impact. Though the International Resource Panel says that 20%, 23% actually of GHG emissions globally come from the production of the raw materials only. So that's not even talking about products, it's the raw materials only, which is equivalent to all agricultural and land use emissions. And by the way, and to go back to your first question, why does it come so late to the discussion, and why is it still not that represented in the discussion? Well, the International Resource Panel, which is the sister organization to the IPCC, it's like the IPCC for materials and resources, is only 14 years old. And it hasn't had the time to establish that narrative yet, and it's still pushing it through. And for a long time, we focused, and rightly so, on the energy transition and renewable and energy efficiency. And coming with a new narrative on circular economy sometimes feels like, you know, we're not done yet with that first discussion. Don't ask us to consider this on top. I have to do climate and I have to do circular economy on top of it. As you were saying, Lorna, it's not on top of it, it's a mechanism, it's a delivery mechanism. 45% of GHG emissions come from the products and the food that we have in the system. And that, if we don't tackle it, looking at renewable energy and energy efficiency alone will not get us to the 1.5 degrees that we need. And actually, it is about creating the narrative, it is about making sure that it's a solution space and not something that adds to the burden of what governments and businesses have to do, because it is also a business opportunity. You know, since 2010, when there was a lot of volatility in resource and commodity markets, businesses have started to see the importance of having a sound material management and also some visibility on, can I also see further down the line how much I'm going to spend on my material bill. And if you can treat your products as material banks and consider that these assets are yours because they have a value and you have an interest in retaining them, then you lower planned obsolescence. And of course it's not easy because the accounting rules at the moment mean that anything that's a stock is not really valuable on a balance sheet. So all the enabling conditions have to be put in place as well. But the fact is that looking at durability, looking at giving SMEs the opportunity to first of all understand what circular economy is, and I know that Zero Waste Scotland is managing a circular economy fund for SMEs, roughly 18 million if I remember correctly. I'd be interested actually to get your sense on how this is progressing. So all of this needs to be put on the table as an opportunity to A, advance the agenda, and B, also create the conditions for a resilient and positive economy going forward.
I would actually very much agree with what Joss is saying about the stage of the circular economy and the thinking process for tackling climate change. I mean, I'm struck by the fact as you wander around the blue zone, just how many issues are being tackled by so many delegates on a daily basis. The complexity of how you achieve net zero, adding circular economy principles into this, it requires a little bit of thinking for the average business or the average citizen to really truly understand what circularity means. And that's something we found at Glasgow Chamber. We've been working with Ian and his team at Zero Waste Scotland for the past 5 years on trying to communicate what we think circular economy principles can do for your businesses. And it has taken time for the range of issues that circular economy covers really to sink in. I can think of a couple of companies where the light has come on quite late in the process for them setting their net zero strategies, but then it has dawned on them that actually their entire business model, it's not just a question of trying to make the existing business model work and recycle all the materials that they're using. It's actually, can they build a business model that doesn't need those materials at all in the first place? That's quite a fundamental thought process to go through. And I think we're getting there. It's early days. So I'm not surprised the circular economy doesn't feature as a dead straightforward, right, we're going to tackle deforestation or we're going to stop coal power stations. It's a much, much more thoughtful approach to tackling zero waste. My one concern about the challenge set to us this morning, however, is the use of the word consumption. Because that in itself is potentially confusing for a pure business economist like myself. Consumption to me basically just means household spending. And one of the challenges we face here is if you say reduce consumption, our economy rather depends on household spending. What happens? Actually, what we're really meaning is stopping the consumption of materials and the consumption of resources. And I think that when you get the clarity of that across, businesses start to think, actually, of course, because that's cost reduction. If I can do this without materials, I'm obviously going to cut my costs. It's not just about where do I put my waste materials in a process, who can I give them to, how can I use them in a different way. I actually don't need the materials at all because I've changed my business model. That's so much more fundamental. Just takes time to go through that thinking process.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that's something we've had to navigate through our conversations around consumption. You're right, just in itself, it's actually smarter consumption, as you say, or consumption without waste as well. I mean, that's another thing that we're trying to obviously prevent. The wastefulness, the throwaway issue of our society. So going back to your point, Joss, about the numbers on our funding, we have obviously been quite successful with our support for businesses. People will know. So with Scotland, we've supported about 240 individual companies to date, looking at identifying new circular opportunities and strategies within their businesses. We've invested £12 million of that, £18 million so far, into some of those companies, and that's leveraged in another, I think it's £36 million of other funding as well. So it's not just our money that has been making the difference. So there is, and if, so I probably should have said, so this session is one of 4 or 5 sessions we're having today, and the sessions in the middle of the day are basically with those businesses. We're going to bring them in here to showcase what they've been doing and the opportunities that these see in front. Some of those very successful. I think the other thing to say is this is online as well, this event, so it's not just, so there'll be opportunities to record that and record with these businesses and play it back through our microsite, which is up running at the moment. So that's the thing. We see lots of opportunities. We think there's a number of businesses who are grasping this. They're seeing both from a startup point of view, but also from an existing business model. They need to shift it. They need to think differently about it. So there's certainly an appetite out there. We're seeing that. I think there's still a challenge, I think, about, how do we scale some of those up? How do they become, more, the impact is much greater, whether it's a new technology, whether it's a new service, that they're selling rather than a product. So I guess that's possibly a question. So what's the role of government? What's the role of business? What's the role of cities to really create that market demand for those businesses? Because in some respects, if they were all here, all these businesses in the room, they'll say, well, what's next for you? They're thinking, well, we want somebody to buy this new service, buy this new product. Somebody wants to invest in this new technology. They're all ready to go. They've all done their identification. They're all really excited about what they're doing, but there's something that needs to happen to make that, to go to the next level.
Well, I want to talk about different types of businesses as well, because I think that there's a significant role for other business models, cooperative businesses and social enterprises who are doing really good work in these spaces. And just because a business is a cooperative doesn't mean that it has to be a small business. You can scale up cooperatives too. I mean, John Lewis is the obvious example, but the co-op in ScotMid as well. That it is possible to have cooperative business models or social enterprise models that are very successful businesses that pay living wages, that are active in their communities, that are, full-on proper businesses. And I think we spend too much effort on looking at only profit-making business. So I think one of the roles of government, and it's a profit-making business. So I think one of the roles of government, and it's certainly in the cooperation agreement we have with the Scottish Government, is about supporting those other business models, because I think that there's probably quite a strong triangulation between restoring our high streets, cooperative and social enterprises, and our need to pay living wages and have businesses that invest in their local communities. There's no particular reason why every high street should look the same. Actually, high streets should have local businesses, and then local communities should benefit from those businesses. So I think that there's a lot of work that can be done there. I know in my own neighborhood, we have businesses, refilling businesses, where I can take my bottle of laundry detergent and dish soap and they will refill them for me. We have a tool library where I live as well, so that I don't need to buy a drill and a saw and those things. I pay £20 a year and then I can borrow those things, a lawnmower, an angle grinder, anytime I want, and the tools are always kept in good condition, in top-notch condition, so I know they're safe to use. So that's a wonderful service that has reduced consumption in the sense that not everybody in my neighborhood needs to buy those tools that mostly sit in a cupboard, but actually we can all get on with building our fences and gardens and so on because we have access to those tools. So I think that there is some good things happening, and I think it's up to government and very much in my role and what we've got with the cooperation agreement with the Scottish Government to support those kind of businesses to scale up, to make sure that everyone in Scotland has access to a tool library, a refilling remakery, where they take in old IT equipment, strip it down to its absolute, even down to the copper and the chips, and they make sure every single bit of that gets either reused or recycled. So more and more of that, please. It's already happening. We just need to scale it up.
And in order for that to happen, in order for these pieces of equipment to be dismantled, and in order for the resources to be recuperated and reused, then there's a design element as well. So the upstream part of, if I'm going to put something on the market that cannot be repurposed or at least recycled at a high level of quality, then maybe there shouldn't be a place on the market for that. And that's the role of government as well. There was enabling conditions, making the economics work for the circular economy as well. At the moment, the system is hardwired for and by volume and throughput. And in order to change the cost and incentive structure, in order to get that circulation of valuable materials, it really is important to foster that dialogue between the private and the public sector. There's no lack of private sector innovation, no lack of private sector money either that can go into research and development of new business models or new materials. But if the conditions aren't aligned, these things will not scale. So it really is important to agree on the sense of direction as well. And in order to also look at creating a common sense of language and what we mean by the circular economy, the terminology of consumption is very telling in that sense. Actually, when we talk about consumption, we do talk about money flows. We don't talk about consumption. Last time I consumed a washing machine, I can't remember that, right? You don't actually do that. You just get the service that you need through purchasing a certain volume of materials that you then don't know what to do with. That's the problem. And in order to access that service, we talk a lot about products as a service, performance-based business models, as if they existed. But the reality is you can't really find them out there because the conditions aren't right. And it's not because business don't want to provide them. They would. They're agnostic when it comes to where the profit comes from. As long as the economic activity is sustained, you know, it can be like that or through a better chain of logistics, whatever. As long as it makes business sense, it works. So the important thing is to foster that dialogue and make sure that it does make business sense to go in the right direction as well.
I have sympathy with the Minister's comments about social enterprise and local business models, but I wouldn't be a Chamber of Commerce if I didn't say that actually I don't think we're going to achieve net zero if we don't get the private sector in its existing form fully on board. And if there's been one decision made so far this week, or announcement made so far in the last week rather, it was the announcement by Mark Carney about the Glasgow Financial Alliance for net zero, the 95 trillion pounds worth of funds under management, which would be directed towards net zero end goals. Now that is scale, that's enormous. If you think then what that really means in, say, choose the building industry, the potential then to start asking development companies, construction companies, and the funders behind those companies, why do you build a building for 25 years? Why do you not build a building for 100 years? And why do you not design it to be circular? We've just gone through a pandemic where we're now questioning what is exactly the need for certain types of office building or certain types of retail unit. It's incredibly difficult at the moment to adapt those into the new uses in the future. Quite often leads to demolition and rebuild, new build. The extent at which circularity becomes supported by financiers, because they can see the long-term return benefits, would be such a dramatic change to that one industry. And that one industry is an enormous part of the waste that we have to deal with at a local level in a city, building waste from demolition. So I just think that we've got to think at that level if we're going to really make a difference with the circular economy. I know that there are, I mean, we had one of the most fascinating sessions we had as the Chamber was between the finance industry and the construction industry, or particularly the development industry, about what it would take to encourage circular buildings. We had ABN AMRO across from Amsterdam. We had Owen Zacharias, who's a developer in Amsterdam, explaining how they went about developing a circular building, a circular industrial estate. And the extent to which you have to actually invest a lot more upfront in order to be able to get that long-term benefit. Your returns do come later. The funders have to be set up for that. If Mark Carney is right, and that 95 trillion is now going to be available on that basis, that's fundamental. That's such a big change to such an important industry.
I'm really interested to what you have to say there, because one of the big parts, I think, of the circular economy, and something I talk about a lot, is about building to last. And so I'm curious, as a businessman, do you think we are now at the end of this particular type of entrepreneurial model, which was very trendy in the noughties, which was the sort of build fast, fail quick. And we're now going, no, we're not interested in build fast, fail quick. We're interested in building for the long term. We're interested in building businesses that last, businesses that will employ this generation, the next generation, and the generation after. Do you think we're ready for that change?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer, because build fast, fail quick is a kind of entrepreneurial slogan around take a risk. If you want to start businesses and you are going to plan your way to the nth degree, you may never get started. So the general sense of start quick, fail fast is have a go. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to consume resources. So I'm not sure that I would wholly understand how that would change in the context of a circular model. What I do agree, however, is that you build products, services that will last for an awful lot longer. Hence my particular interest in the building industry. Because then a developer has to ask, okay, I make my money at the moment out of building a building that will last 25 years. And if it lasts longer than that, or at least, they never last just for 25 years, but they have to be maintained at a much higher level after 25 years. If that doesn't happen, then how am I going to make my money? How's my long-term model going to work? Well, actually, it may be that your long-term model is about the owning and servicing of that building and the adaptation of the building as uses change. So you're actually charging more in the longer term for your service in adapting the building to meet changing market needs as the years go by. So the building you built with a shop in it and co-working space and maybe a bit of hotel in 15 years' time, maybe the hotel no longer has the demand for it, but it's already been designed to be converted into the next use that is relevant at that time. As a developer, you get your money from doing the adaptation at that time. That's the kind of thinking that we need to go through in order to change a model that says build and only build for 25 years.
So picking up on that, because there is all these declarations around money, that's all we need. We just need this money. And as you said, Mark Carney in the world is saying, here's trillions of dollars, here's this, here's that. But as you just said, and I think we all agree, I'm sure most people agree who have thought about this in terms of the circular economy and that issue about how do we address consumption, smarter consumption, it does take a shift in mindset. It does take that shift and collaboration. And I know I've said this many times, I think, my experience working with Zero Waste Scotland and partners like yourself, Stuart, the collaboration is possibly more powerful than the money. It's actually getting people in the room to talk, not just to talk, but to share the challenges, but also these opportunities with different businesses and from different sectors who normally possibly don't actually come into the room together, coming together to think about some of these, new business opportunities, but some of these real opportunities for the city of Glasgow. But how do we invest in that then? I guess that's all this money is great to some extent, it feels like an answer, but we need to invest in that change of mindset. So just interested in what you're seeing in Glasgow, but also from a government, is this education, is this awareness, is it networking? What is it that we could be doing to accelerate this? Because I still think that's where we sort of lack the investment. And maybe it's money, maybe it's specifically, or maybe it's more effort in education and awareness.
One thing that strikes me, and I'll hand it over to you, Stuart, in your question, is the fact that oftentimes we talk about big pots of money available, but they're framed in terms of things that will help us fix a situation that shouldn't have existed in the first place. And it's really not often that actually that money is available to foster innovation, to go into education, to change the mindset, really. You're not changing the mindset when you're scrambling around thinking, I need to clean up the mess, and there's a big pot of money, thank God for that. Actually, the problem is more long-term than that. And getting the circular economy to become a solutions framework rather than what it's been framed as for a long time as a waste management strategy, and getting it to sit within the Ministry of Economy and Finances and not only be the sole remit of the environmental ministries is also very important. So all of that really is, yes, the money is great when it comes, but when it comes, there's a sense of urgency and we're going to fix stuff and plug holes. It's not that money is going to be invested in redesigning the ship, it's preventing it from sinking, and that's a massive issue. I
guess the answer, how do you get that mindset spread around? of course, there's going to be different answers depending on different people. But in our own experience, every business is going to respond most quickly to its consumers, and then second most quickly to its shareholders. Bigger ones, probably it's the other way around. But much more important, actually, is listening to other business folk that you respect. It's your peer group. It's always the same. In every issue, trying to spread the word, it's your peer group that make the difference. So I look around Glasgow, and we've managed to get together a group of about 200 of the businesses in Glasgow have joined the Circular Glasgow Network and are actively engaged in understanding how circular economy principles might work in their businesses. But we have 30 ambassadors who are the most energetic, most eloquent, most persuasive individuals. I'm thinking of people like Jo Chidley at the Beauty Kitchen. She is a phenomenon in the cosmetics world, or Tony Burns in ACS Clothing in the sustainable fashion world. And they are out there relentlessly explaining what they've done with their business models and the way in which they think that those models can work for others. And we've seen that having an impact in the whisky industry. I can think of companies like Scottish Leather Group in the fashion industry again, or in the textiles industry, I should have said, that are making fundamental changes to the way their businesses work because they have within them champions who are pursuing circular economy principles. That network of peers is absolutely invaluable. And I have to say, of all the things we're proud of over the last 5 years as a chamber, it has been building up that network and releasing it onto the city at every opportunity. I was just doing an event before this with Tony from ACS Clothing, as he explains not just what he is doing for the circular economy, but also what he's doing for just transition. Because I think one of the things that I find within the business community, especially in Glasgow, this is a city that's been through a transition that wasn't that just 30 years ago, and the business community remembers that, feels it. A lot of them are of a vintage that's not dissimilar to me. They do not want to see that happen again through the Green Revolution, nor do they particularly want to export unjust transition to other countries. They want to see just transition occur across the community, across the city, but across the world as well. That means thinking through the consequences of change. So they're not just thinking circular economy, they're also thinking the social impact of change that's coming from the Green Revolution. Demonizing business as a set of people who don't care about their community is completely inaccurate. We should work with the grain. They all want to do it.
That's lovely to hear. Just on a personal note there, I think there's definitely a business opportunity in women's cosmetics. It's something that drives me crazy. As a woman in the public view, I carry around makeup with me all the time, and there are always these really flimsy little plastic things that crack in your bag and drop powder everywhere. So if there's a business out there that can make cosmetic cases that are made out of something recyclable like aluminium or steel or 3D printed, that I can refill, that won't crack in my bag, you have to please take my money. Please take my money. Oh my goodness. Anyway, so there you go. There's loads of business opportunities in the circular economy. But what I wanted to talk about was the question, what can we do and what role do governments have? In many of these areas, for example, France is far ahead of the other countries of Europe. And one of the exciting things they're working on developing, which I very much hope we can adopt here in due course, is a repairing standard and appropriate labeling. So that when you buy something, I'm thinking of like my Hoover at home where a little plastic bit on it broke and then the whole thing stops working, even though the rest of it's fine. You know, luckily my husband knows how to mold plastic and could fix it, but good heavens. You know, so when you buy something like a toaster or a Hoover or whatever it is, that it would have a label on it saying this is repairable, here's where you can take it to repair, here's where you can buy the parts to repair, this is designed to repair, so that you have this and you can then own it for 30 years because it can be repaired. You don't own it for 3 years and then it breaks and you have to go and buy a new one. So that is one of those very material things where, you know, governments can support by adopting these sort of standards and labeling, which then encourages businesses so that no one business feels like they're having to put their neck out or, you know, get ahead and lose their competitiveness if everybody has to follow the same sort of rules. So that's something to look out for in your own life. You know, if you have the cash flow that you are able to buy things that will last or be repaired. The problem, of course, is when people don't have that kind of cash flow availability. I don't know if there's any Terry Pratchett fans in the house. It's the Captain Vimes theory of boots, is that if you are reasonably well off, you can buy a pair of boots that will last you 25 years for, let's say, £40. But if you're not so well off, you can only buy yourself a pair of boots that will last 5 years, but that pair will cost you £15. So you have to, over the course of a longer period, buy more pairs of boots, and it costs you more just because you don't have that cash flow available to you. So part of all of this is figuring out what's accessible to people and making it easier for people to make the right decisions, making it easier for people to repair things themselves. You might not be able to afford the expensive thing that's going to last longer, but we can give you the tools and the knowledge, and you have a community center where you can go and repair the thing and keep it going without too much cost. So there's a big change of mindset there around when we buy something, that this is going to be something we own for a long time, and we're going to value it, and we're going to learn to be proud of our skills in repairing things. Look what I did. I made this. I repaired this. I altered this. It's a different way of valuing ourselves as humans, not just for what we can buy, but for what we can do.
My anecdotal thing, I was on a webinar a couple of weeks ago talking about fast fashion, and the chap from Australia, I can't remember his name now, and he was talking about that, about how when people ask you, well, how much did you pay for that? Because I was talking about, well, you should say you lease it or you rent it and stuff like that. But even if you buy it, and his interesting way of describing it was, instead of the price, it's the price per wear, you should say. So, the whole idea of you have a pair of boots, whatever, £40, £100, you pay it, and you work out, I'm probably having them for 5 years, I'm going to wear them 5 days a week. So you say, well, these are a penny a wear. My God, that's great, isn't it? And it's a way of just shifting the dial, so to speak, to get people to engage in that whole idea rather than the price. Anyway, just Josh, you were going to come in.
Yeah, on the French example, because it's true that they've worked on the national roadmap, and we sat on the advisory board for 2 years, and a lot of the thinking was, how do we get to the market the right stuff so that it doesn't then depend on the citizen to make the right choice. The wrong choice should be edited out in the first place, and that comes through getting the durability index, forcing manufacturers and retailers to put the right spare parts on the market as well, the availability thereof. But then that triggers another interesting question is, do we then need to have warehouses full of spare parts for absolutely everything? Well, part of the answer is in those community centers, hacker labs, repair spaces, additive manufacturing, 3D printing, because you don't waste that material if you do it once. And actually, it's really interesting to see that it is picking on. The material and the feedstock of these things should be looked at as well, because then it needs to be recyclable, etc. But it's a whole system, and that's why it does take time as well. Having said that, they have a really nice roadmap, but they still don't have a minister. So you may want to outdo them on the... No, you just do better here, actually, and come up with a circular economy bill that's going to blow everybody out of the water. But I'm just insisting on this because it's all about upstream. It's all about the design requirements, the eco-design, and coupled with that, extended producer responsibility. It's the nature and the volume of what we put on the market and what we can do with it. It's about being custodians of those materials that have an impact in terms of GHG and potential pollution as well. It's keeping them in the system.
And that's back to the point about businesses. I agree about language sometimes. So many of these 240 businesses we've worked with are social enterprise, that are engaging in this, and cooperatives and B Corps. And we also work with the Revolve network, which is 40-odd, involved in reuse and repair. And I think, going back to your point, Josh, because the Ellen MacArthur Foundation kind of led on the idea that the circular economy it's not just a new economy, it's a restorative and regenerative economy. And, we see that because of things like, 3D printing, etc. You don't have to take all the materials out of communities and bring them into the central belt of Scotland or put them in a container and ship them out. We can actually do things with those materials at a local level, to create jobs, to create good jobs, to create social inclusion opportunities, to create local economies. I see from Stuart's point of view, he's got the challenge of a city, but Scotland, if the circular economy is all about just taking all the good materials out of those economies, and doing something with them in the cities. Fair enough, good for the cities, but that's not going to help, you know, the other parts of Scotland. So I think, I just don't think that gets across as much when we talk about the circular economy opportunities, certainly here, as we do. I think we could, you know, certainly talk more about those you know, social opportunities that to some extent, you know, technology enables now. Particularly now that we're all staying at, you know, we've all learned to work at home to some extent.
Yeah, I think you can tie all those things together, can't you, Joss? What you're talking about, where if you design something in the first place, that it can be repaired, and when you sell it, you issue to all your local repair centres the 3D CAD files of their parts, and then you could have those all over Scotland. I have got this model of Hoover, we've got the CAD file for that, I'll print you off the part you need. That would be a wonderful local business that doesn't require, I mean, a 3D printer's, you know, relatively cheap these days. You know, so that's another opportunity where there are business models in this new economy that we can absolutely see. So this isn't a bad news story. There are loads of business opportunities. It's about finding them and then facilitating people to start those businesses.
And I would say it's not just a new model. This model is already operating within the traditional industrial sectors. I can think of a large engineering company that makes pumps, that services those pumps using 3D printing on site in international locations all across the world, which of course reduces the need to transport components, store components, and reduces also the time of disruption of the process. So it's happening already, even within what I'd call the traditional economy. So it isn't just about local communities responding in that way. It fits within the traditional model as well.
So I agree, and we've got examples of that, companies we've helped and supported the investment of that. But maybe it's about how do we accelerate it? Because we can talk about these things and they happen, but they kind of either happen at a pace that's not, you know, we need it to be faster in terms of the climate change and all the agendas we've just talked about. But they also don't happen by accident, some of those real opportunities. We need to design them. It comes back to possibly the role of government. How do we support that infrastructure? And I use that term loosely. You know, if it's repair, reuse infrastructure, how do we create the economies of scale that, you know, the people who want to run those businesses can come together and, you know, work together more collaboratively? How do we create a different approach to, and use business again, you know, social enterprises? Because it's great when they happen, but have we got enough time to wait for them just to happen? Or do we not have to have a much more applied design of the infrastructure we want and the businesses we want and the models that we want, and to support that happening, particularly at a local level, at a place level, whether that's in the cities or actually in the, you know, Highlands and Islands of Scotland?
It's a big question. You could tackle it through various angles, but again, I think the enabling conditions are really important. There's no lack of innovation. There's no lack of money going towards innovation. Between 2018 and 2020, the number of private equity funds that mentioned circular economy just went from 1 to 15 in less than 2 years. And granted, you know, the overall aggregated number might not be as impressive as 93 trillion just yet, but it's growing exponentially. The question is, what is there for those businesses to say, we're going to bet on those strategies because they're going to be there in the 20 years to come? There's a visibility element, and what the European Union has done with the Circular Economy Action Plan is saying, this is the direction. We're going to bet on durability. We're going to phase out toxic materials. We're going to close the loop on the right stuff. There's no point promoting recycling if you keep on feeding the wrong materials to the system. Then you compound toxicity. And one thing that we haven't talked about yet, because we focused a lot on high-value materials, is the application of those circular strategies to the agricultural sector and the bioeconomy. Because we also need to close the nutrient cycle. Some of the organic waste that should go back to the fields and fertilize the lands, they don't do that anymore. There's a host of business opportunities that are not only dealing with rare earth metals and precious components. It's also a way to make sure that the system focuses on maintaining the value of what we have in circulation, as opposed to just getting it to flow quicker in order to generate more profit. And this is why I think the private sector, public sector dialogue is so critical, because the enabling conditions, as soon as they're right, that innovation and that investment is going to flow towards the circular economy, for sure.
I mean, it's interesting to talk hear about, you know, the different leaderships in different industries. And Josh talks about the nutrients and food waste and so on. I'm coming from an engineering background, so I'm just thinking in my mind of an example of a European company that makes bearings, and they are looking at a zero waste, a circular, to do with the lubrication, the oil that goes into those bearings. Because industry globally uses a ton of oil, and once that oil's got grit and muck in it, we throw it away because you don't want grit and muck in your machinery. It'll stop working. So they're trying to develop systems to allow you to filter that oil and then be able to reuse it. And these are other examples of different industries. So this isn't just something that happens with food waste. It isn't just something that happens with cosmetics and clothing. This is something that needs to happen all the way through industry. And that includes developing processes and designing those things so that you can refurbish bearings. And I don't mean like the little bearings in your skateboard. I mean the kind of bearings that run huge machines. Those things cost tens of thousands of pounds just for them. So it's absolutely worth taking them out, regrinding them, and putting them back together, because there are tons of valuable materials in there that you wouldn't want to throw away. So I think a lot of these industries are looking at that as embedded value. Well, this is an asset, and who owns that asset? So instead of me selling you a bearing that's now your problem to look after, we're going to have a scheme whereby you sort of hire the bearing off of me and I will keep it in good condition for you. And so you pay, instead of buying that bearing once, you hire it off me. It's that sort of per use, on a per use basis. And the deal will be that I'll keep it working for you. I'll do the maintenance. I'll do whatever it takes to keep that working. Your machine keeps running, so you get to keep making your profits. And you aren't responsible for the maintenance of that either. What you want is the bearing to keep working no matter what. No problem. I'm the bearing expert. I can do that for you. So there's these new models of businesses coming through, which aren't about just buying stuff, owning things. It's almost like the tool library effect writ large in industry, where we're talking about paying to use, pay per use of things rather than paying to own things. Because owning something's no good in the sense that now I've got to maintain this thing. Now I've got to dispose of this thing. Oh my goodness. You can make that somebody else's problem and still make your profits.
Just picking up on the question about government. I mean, government's got a whole variety of tools it can use to promote circular principles. I might, for example, think in terms of back to my thoughts on the building industry. The planning, obviously the planning system will have a significant impact on what is feasible to do at a local level in construction. And so a complete review of what planning would have to do to change to support circularity, especially if that's being reinforced by the financiers saying we're keen to invest in circular buildings. So step one, planning. Step two, investing in the skills around design. Glasgow has a long tradition of design, one of the oldest design schools in the world, formed in Glasgow, and now the Glasgow School of Art. I'd love to see more investment through the education funding system in design, in whether it's Glasgow School of Art or the University of Strathclyde. There are or Glasgow, you name them. There are so many opportunities to review what product design, service design skills could look like in a country that is keen to implement circularity. And then finally, I do agree that regulation will have a role to play. Regulation, you imagine I might sit here and say, oh, red tape there. But actually, regulations quite often help you become more globally competitive if they are thoughtfully designed and they're well in advance of others. You're not just playing catch up. They can really make a difference to the quality of the innovation in your own industries.
Well, I like to think of regulation as leveling the playing field for businesses, reducing the risk. So it would be great if a business, felt that they could be an innovator and move ahead. But the risk, of course, would be to their business model, so they feel constrained. I would hope that well-designed regulations would empower all businesses to take that step, so they know they're not having to do it on their own. All their competitors are having to do it too, and so nobody is disadvantaged by doing the right thing.
Yep. Good. So, it's interesting to talk about skills, because you're right. I think there is, we say there's some, perhaps in the past, people thought the circular economy was some sort of sector that needed investment, but actually circular skills need to be across everything in terms of product design, in terms of service, no matter what, because things need to be different. And I think a lot more of that, thinking about, I know I've said this before, we talk a lot about green jobs, but as if there's this subset of the economy that's going to do it all for us, do all the green stuff, and that's great. But actually, we all need to be an element of green, no matter what we do, whether you're a school teacher, a dentist, or otherwise, the world is going to be, well, radically different if we're going to hit those targets, both in 2030 targets and 2045 targets for Scotland. Things are going to be different, and I wonder whether there is more that we could be doing to try and not just, talk about the circular economy, but talk about that consumption, what are products going to be made of, how are they going to be designed, how are we going to use them. So you might not be in the design space, but how are we going to use them going forward, because that is ultimately about this consumption, being smarter about it. But we're all going to have to get used to that, and I sometimes say it's a bit like, my example is it's a bit like digital literacy. Yeah, there's lots of investment, and you hate to use the word geeks, but people in the technical space when it comes to digital and AI. But we all have to be digitally literate. We all have smartphones and things online now, and booking things in restaurants and stuff like that. So we all have to really understand it. So I wonder whether there's that approach. Do we need that type of approach for our circular economy to ensure that we're reaching out to everybody to make sure they're thinking about what the future might look like?
I guess I'm interested in, I'll stop, I feel like I'm dominating a bit, but I'll let you go in a second. But I'm interested in whether we think it's being green or whether we think it's just being more efficient. Because we're talking about waste, we really mean waste. Like that example that I had of the carbon monoxide monitors. The business had to produce that material, that resource. They had to pay someone to design it, pay someone to assemble it, buy the materials, ink, all that stuff had to happen. If they didn't have to do that, if they didn't have to spend that money, what else could they do with their business that would be exciting and innovating? So there must be an element here of efficiency. The way we've been running all of our businesses, throwing away valuable materials, is inefficient. So I wonder if it's less about being green and more about being efficient.
Oh, very true. And an indicator of performance could be how long a business can maintain its materials or components or products in use rather than how much it can get through the door. It's a question of getting it to a cyclical way of looking at things and deriving value from it, and also counting and potentially integrating the negative externalities and really looking at targeting the stuff that we don't want to see happen should be disincentivized. It makes intuitive sense. And as you say, Lorna, it is about efficiency. It's about material efficiency. It's about being able to also monitor that efficiency in terms of environmental gains, in terms of regeneration of natural spaces, in terms of elimination of waste by design, not as an afterthought with an added cost. It's about how can we be on the front foot. It is about being clever and being efficient and being prospective and having a bit of foresight.
Thoroughly agree with the idea that it isn't about green, it's about efficiency. I think, well, that's the kind of language that makes it dead straightforward to have a conversation with a chamber member about why circularity would be part of that response. So and that's exactly what we find. As we're going around chatting to businesses, we tend to find that the killer argument is you are going to reduce your costs as a result of this. Now, it will be occasionally that you're going to come up against businesses where the business model depends on that throughput of goods. And you're going to have the debate about how you create value more through the sustenance of the goods rather than the throughput. That is the most difficult argument or the most difficult discussion to have. But it's certainly in an economy like ours that has shifted in Glasgow, shifted so strongly away from manufacturing and more towards service, that's not such a difficult discussion to have as it would be if you were frankly, in China.
I mean, I think some of the problem with the throughput industries, which you've been discussing, and this comes into packaging and waste as well, is that they have depended on a business model that depends on the public purse cleaning up their waste that they create. So in the industry that I was coming from, when we build a tidal turbine, we also have to put money to decommission it. Like, that's part of it. We're responsible for decommissioning what we make. And something that will be brought in here is the extended producer responsibility. If you make something, you are also, the same as I was in my industry, you are responsible for cleaning it up. And I think a big problem that we've had is that some businesses have been depending on the public purse cleaning up the waste that they make. And so we need to make sure that is less the case, that people who produce are also cleaning.
But the public will still pay. because ultimately the public will pay the price for the increased price of the good. So it will still come, it will be circular in that regard. It will still come back to the public in some form. So I take the point. The question I have in my mind is which parts of the waste management system are better done by government and which are better done by individual organisations. It's simply an SME trying to look out for where its products end up in China is a remarkably different, if that's where they're selling to, that's a remarkably difficult ask. So there has to be a balance between what governments do and what companies do in terms of responsibility. Otherwise, price goes through the roof and the customer ends up paying for it.
But maybe there's a question for Josh. I always wonder what's going to come first, producer responsibility or basically companies wanting the materials back. I mean, you talk about the monoxide tool that you've got. You know, one of the challenges we all know going forward is, you know, as we all of the countries committing to net zero and the money being available for infrastructure, whether that's renewables, whether it's heat pumps, whether it's a whole raft of infrastructure that's required, what are we going to make those materials, these products from? Where are we going to get all of the critical materials, you know, both for us here in Scotland and the UK and all of the other countries that are developing that? And I just wonder whether that's going to drive a much more circular system approach by these companies, because it's going to be possibly easier for them to get the stuff back rather than actually go out and well, possibly we should be discouraging them from winning more materials from the earth and all the environmental impacts that have. So maybe that's an interesting thing. What comes first, or do we just stand back and let it happen?
Oh God, I'm not sure I want to answer that one in.
It was a throwaway question at the end, Josh.
But for sure, I mean, more and more the economy is happening by taking into account the physical realities of the planet, which hasn't been the case for a long time, because we considered that waste sinks were abundant and we could dig out all the resources that we needed and everything was available. Again, coming back to 2010, 2011, the average European car manufacturer saw its material bill rise by 50% in 6 months. And then those circular economy strategies became massively important and became actually strategic for the businesses. Rather than having a token remanufacturing plant, companies started to think, actually, I do want these engines back. I do want that drivetrain back because I can remake it. Because the energy expenditure of a remanufactured engine is 80% less than a virgin one made from pure raw materials, which granted doesn't happen anymore because most of the engines made have already a percentage of recycled material in them. But theoretically, you're talking about an 80% reduction in material cost. Therefore, the business side of things is pretty straightforward. It's about being efficient. It's about making the numbers stack up. They see that. The extended producer responsibility stuff is potentially a bit more difficult to implement because it needs to track. It needs to also make sure that some, and looking at the packaging examples, it's really high volume but low value. And getting the PROs, the organizations that look after these schemes to get the right level of a modulation of the fee as well is really important, because it's really easy to pitch a symbolic sum of money for the cleanup, but actually that doesn't, if it doesn't have an impact on the design upstream, then it's missing the point. The point of a good extended producer responsibility scheme is that it trickles upstream and influences the design, because you don't want to continue paying for the cleanup cost if you're bearing the brunt of that. So it is about finding the right mechanisms and the right price points. And at some point, yes, the consumer or the citizen or the user is going to be impacted by that. But to a certain extent, it will also drive those citizens to solutions that are less expensive potentially. So there's an effect there as well.
Okay, so that probably segues to the next session, which is going to be about packaging, and I'm sure producer responsibility is going to be talked about as well. So we're now at the end of our session. It's interesting, I always think, because people always sometimes ask me, how did I get involved in recycling? And it's interesting because I grew up in Alloa, where they make glass, and they introduced the very first class recycling system in Scotland. And the reason they did it was exactly that, the high energy costs, you know, at the time for making glass. Somebody obviously worked out that if we brought more cullet back in and just added that to the mix, it would reduce our energy cost. And, you know, that was 1970s. So it's still the fact, isn't it? It's a kind of bizarre thing. Anyway, just a bit of anecdotal there. So thank you to everyone, and thank you online to the people who've been watching this online. I thought it was a thoroughly enjoyable discussion, and you played your part very well. Thank you, panel. So just like to thank you all in the usual way. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.